OK, data-driven DevOps. Before I jump into that, let me just talk a little bit about myself. So my name is Jagan Subramanian. I'm the VP of Solution at JFrog. Solution at JFrog is all, you guys have probably interfaced with some of my team members already. So right from solution architecture, where the architects are talking to you guys about best practices, how to scale, what should be the architecture to deploy. There's another team that works on a lot of the partnerships and ecosystem side of things. So things that you heard, like the OpenShift integration, the NetApp integration, this is part of the same organization. And of course, I'm sure you guys have experienced the high level of the support that you get. So these are all also engineers on our side. But more interestingly, prior to JFrog, which is a little bit of a focus of the data-driven aspect of it, I was at Oracle for a very, very long time, as you can see. Did a bunch of things. But most lately and most relevant is being part of the middleware organization, moving a 7,000 developer organization to adopt DevOps practices. This was a few years ago. And there were interesting challenges. And what I want to share with you guys is a little bit about how metrics helped us make the transformation faster. OK. All right, so a quick thing on the agenda, just a quick recap of the DevOps transformation and how thinking about metrics helps when you do it quite early. A little bit about what that feedback means and how you can utilize the feedback. And then, as promised in the description of the talk, a few measures that you can take away with you as things that you can ponder upon and maybe use. And then I also wanted to share a little bit about what we do internally as well, within JFrog, and how this metrics-driven sort of view of our DevOps transformation helps us move what we need, adopt new things, et cetera. Okay? And then, time permitting, we'll do some Q&A. I just wanted to quickly give a shout out to Eli Givoni, the track manager there. He's also our release manager, QA manager. So I'm sure if you guys have a chance, then you should pick his brains on how he does what he does. OK. So show of hands, how many people are in large organizations trying to go through the DevOps cycle here? All right, quite a few. OK. Are you done? OK. All right. So part of what I wanted to start with is, this is the journey we all know. So this was what was traditional in enterprises. What I wanted to show is this is not only a process and tool and pipeline kind of an issue. This is also a metrics issue, right? So how you measured each of those organizations was also, very siloed. And what was a true measure of success for one part of the organization, so dev or QA or operations, did not necessarily mean was a success measure for the company, which is why you guys are here, which is why we are going through this phase, right? So when we've looked at these diagrams a lot, for me, this is also about the metrics. This is also about bringing together people early on to start discussing what should be measured, right? So to talk a little bit about it, I jumped too quickly. So this is a typical flow, at least for us. Where you started, when you started this journey, you went through an identification phase of all the problems you have, cyclic dependencies, big stacks that you need to move faster, integrate faster, and so on, right? Then you had some ideas to do it. You did some experiments. This is a good place to actually start bringing in the key leaders, key stakeholders from the individual teams. So again, typically in a large organization, somebody central gets tasked with saying, OK, go figure out what this has to be done. And you're kind of left thinking, OK, who do I use? So this is a good place to start collaborating, actually. And as part of this experimenting phase, you actually need to start asking yourself, what do you want to measure, right? How do you say that the ideas you're putting together, the POC you're doing, is actually eventually going to be measurable as a true success, right? OK, so you did the experiment. You're now going on to the implementation. I'm kind of splitting out the implementation and adoption because having a good idea, having it ready, production ready, having the documentation, et cetera, does not mean adoption, right? So you'll have a good set of tools in place. Now you're faced with the onboarding exercise, right? You'll have a few of those early adopters who are probably part of your experimentation phase who will jump on this and say, OK, I'm ready to go. I want to take some of that hit about refactoring my code, doing something a little bit disruptive. But then, this is generally about 10 to 15% of the organization in a large company, I guess. You'll probably have another 15, 20% that says, OK, what you say makes sense, and I can see the proof, and the experiments make sense to me. Tell me what I should do, right? And then there's a large organization, about 60%, that says, OK, I've been doing this for many years. OK, don't tell me what's new. You'll have to prove it to them. How is it better? So as you go through this, you're going to be evaluating the changes. So again, you experimented certain things, you rolled out some things, and when you roll out, some of those assumptions you made may be proven wrong, right? And I'll talk a little bit about it in a second. But the key thing here is did you remember to measure, right, all along the way? Because this is what is going to help you convince some of the organization, convince your management whether the investment is worth it, et cetera, right? And actually, to be more important for yourself, right? You want to know that your decisions were the right decisions, and where do you want to make the changes? So in my experience, at least, these are some of the questions that come up very, very soon. And if you're not measuring, these are the challenges you have, right? So very, very upfront, it's going to be, OK, are you asking to implement new tools? You're asking to do some new processes, new pipelines, asking people to migrate off of legacy systems. How do you measure? If you don't know if it is more robust than the previous system, that's a challenge, right? Similarly, you've asked your management to invest in this, right? So a lot of resources, budgeting has to be done to provide you new if you're in the cloud, great, but it still requires somebody to sanction your cloud budget and a cloud quota. You need to make sure that you can measure that you're using resources efficiently so you can get that investment, right? Measure of work is a pretty interesting thing. So you can have all sorts of things saying, OK, the CPU, memory, that kind of trends, but that doesn't mean anything, right? So you need to start thinking about measuring the amount of work being done, productive work being done or not, right? Improvement in cycle time is pretty straightforward. Everybody jumps at it, but there are variations of what you would consider as cycle time, right? And then finally, it's the cost of change. So when you put all of these together, you can come up with a good measure of the cost it's taking to do this change and whether it's worth it, right? So this is one of the things, as an example, back at Oracle, I think we enjoyed the euphoria for maybe the first 3 months, but pretty soon, the management came down to us to say that, that's great, you've asked a lot of things from teams to do this. There is disruption, there's a little bit of release delays because as people move to new methodologies, there's generally some delay. What is the value out of this, right? The last two are kind of related, right? If you don't have any of those measures, people are not going to be believing in a true change. The gut feeling is limited to the team that has been directly involved in the POC, right? Gut feeling doesn't hold too long, right? And the second is, like I said, the 60%, if you don't have the data, it'll be very hard to convince them that this is a better approach, right? OK, so for me, this is all about building trust. So some of the things that I have, we've experienced at least in the past, and I'm lucky to be at JFrog, which is very focused on the future, and some of these challenges don't exist because people understand it. But at large enterprises, some of the things you want to focus on early will help you succeed in this, right? So remember that big circle of people working together, dev, ops, QA, security, keep adding to that. You need to collaborate with them right from the measures itself, right? It doesn't make sense for you to come up with a measure centrally or with one team to say, this is how I'm going to measure success, right? So as an example, 1 second, So as an example, what I remember from my transformation is, let's take an example of the availability of services, right? If you don't bring the ops team and the dev team together to say, this is what I measure as being a robust system, right? So ops will say, OK, here's a report that says my systems have been up. It's just a simple report of ping times or whatever else, right? Whereas dev will say, OK, you know what? The pipeline was not working for me. So you want to avoid this early on. This was the wall. And you want to make sure that right from the get-go, you get the buy-in. So this thing about blaming each other, et cetera, goes away. You're actually getting people to believe in the common measure, and they actually start working together, right? Remember, tooling is not the DevOps transformation. It's the change in the mindset, right? Secondly, things like transparency. One of the things we did early on was to say, we will never, assume that certain amount of data or certain type of data is not useful and doesn't need to be presented. We were quite adamant in making sure that we had an infrastructure available that made the data available to anybody in the organization, which meant the dev or QA person could look at the ops data, the ops people could look at the dev and QA data. It was not a question of sort of siloing, again, in terms of access to the data. So as an example, we started with and this is where it actually helped us actually. Right from the get-go, when we were implementing Artifactory internally, this is back at Oracle, we got the ops team involved right away. So instead of saying, okay, you're just responsible for providing those servers that are going to run, so let's bring you in, we'll tell you what kind of workload we are looking at. We're going to tell you that these are the kind of touch points we'll have and the teams that are going to be using it. So suddenly we had a much easier discussion with the ops team to say, success means, this has to be the functioning aspect of it. And they had a lot of insight in terms of how to monitor things better at even in the functional aspect of things, right? Continuous improvement. So we started with one CI server for the middleware organization. We thought that's a great idea. Okay, it has tons and tons of slaves, but that might be a good way to manage it because development teams don't really want to be responsible for something 24/7 as a system being up, right? What we found was that was perceived as a lack of autonomy, right? What we thought was like we are providing a good service and taking their concerns out of their hands, turned out to be like, okay, so team A wants to use certain plugins, team B wants to use certain different plugins, and you're in a central system which cannot be taken offline because it's so busy, right? So we went from one CI server to, I think the last count was 280 CI servers, right? So what we did was we said, let's give back a lot of this control back to the team. Interestingly, it's a big morale boost, even if they don't necessarily make that many changes. But what we also did was to say that, okay, it doesn't make sense, large organizations, standardization is actually somewhat of a good thing because you don't want to be managing 280 servers in a central team with people, making changes to them, and then when it breaks, they just come back to you and say, okay, it's broken, fix it for us, right? What we did was we invested in some of the underlying stuff, like, for example, we made sure that the jobs on every CI server would be backed up into Git, right? We also had a event-based pipeline because some of the pipelines went across the masters. So we had an event-based pipeline where we said, okay, all the actions would be preserved in a persistent queue, okay? What we did not take on was to say that, okay, we are going to manage your server. We provided some out-of-the-box monitoring, put some monitoring agents, and made sure that the systems will be up. But let's say a CS server went down. The team had the ability to quickly create a new instance, again, through a self-service mechanism, and be able to sort of restore the job so they didn't really lose any jobs, or maybe they might lose a job or two that that was being worked on at the time of outage. And again, from the persistent queue, restart as many jobs as we could. So this was the investment done by the central team. Rather than thinking their job is actually to make sure the environments are up, we said, let's invest in this aspect of the, in making the platform better, right? Again, this was something we measured. We had, we started measuring queue times. We started measuring, what was perceived to be, unavailability of resources. In fact, it doesn't matter at scale or not. This is something that we learned even at JFrog. So self-service, actually comparative data. So the other thing is, remember that the three groups of very early adopters, followers, and what I call slow movers, maybe. Having comparative data is very powerful, right? When you start showing to to a business unit head how certain teams are really benefiting from the new platform, new methodology, new tools that they're using, versus some other teams are not, that's a very big motivator, right? Very quickly, the P&L owner is going to look at it and say, OK, you guys are a bottleneck for us. So having some sort of comparative dashboard is really good. The other thing what happens is with a comparative dashboard is this, again, gut feel or this perception that things are not really as real as it's being shown, it goes away, right? Perception becomes reality here because all the data is there. Remember, we wanted to keep it transparent, so which means that anybody can go in and look at the detail level logs or other data to ensure that what we are presenting is correct. Self-service drives ownership. So this kind of goes back to the multi-master example, except that having a self-service methodology means that people actually start engaging a little bit more in making sure that the underlying infrastructure is good. What is being presented as, for example, if you go to a template-based pipeline methodology, big organizations, you don't have one pipeline that is good for everybody, right? Now you could either sit there and start architecting pipelines for everybody. Pipelines would mean setting up the right jobs, setting up the right repositories, and so on and so forth. Or you can make a self-service UI. Everything is REST API compatible. This is not your job. Your job is not to create repositories. A lot of what you heard in the talk today, in the platform today, is something that we keep hearing from everybody as a pain that some of the DevOps teams have. This is why we are investing in these capabilities in the product itself, right? What your job is to say, OK, you have to provide a platform that allows people to spin up different types of pipelines very easily, right? What this does is they will be engaged with you in the conversation of what is a good pipeline, rather than saying, OK, this pipeline bottlenecks me, right? And lastly, the chargeback. So this is a pretty interesting one. You guys have seen the storage summary report. How many of you used mission control, for example? Yeah, a few of you, yeah. You can get this data in many different ways, right? But one of the things that large enterprises have as a challenge is you really don't know eventually this system is going to become mission critical, it's going to become large. How do you know who's going to be responsible in terms of, at the very least, funding the next storage increase, right? Or very quickly, it's like, who's hogging up all the resources, and is it the right team, right? So having this metric helps you to figure out if team A, which is using, 60% of your resources, is it 60% valuable to your company? By the way, just having this data very quickly allows management also to be very interested in saying, OK, is this the right place that I'm investing, right? OK, so that's kind of a background. The goal of this session is to talk a little bit about the metrics that in my experience, helped me move along this transformation. So we said 3 metrics. Unfortunately, I can't do just 3. So at a high level, the way I categorize this is there's an operational side of the metrics, and there's a functional side of the metrics. So operational for me is systems, robustness, the perception that this platform, this new methodology is better than the previous one, right? The functional one is the true business value that you're getting out of this, right? So some of these, they are kind of obvious, but what happens is not having very easy access to these metrics and making it available to everybody means that there are assumptions made by different organizations, right? So SLA promise. So I hope you started with a lofty goal, and one of the challenges with the legacy system was that it was very brittle, right? Outages would happen, and it would be inexplicable who was responsible, right? In this one, you should start measuring, what is the uptime you have for your systems, and make it available publicly, right? How many, 5 nines or whatever is your goal, is it being achieved? It's good feedback for you also, right? Because if you're not doing that, then what's the point? You need to focus on improving that. Similarly, so effective user resources comes back again. So I don't know if you guys can see a little bit on the side. Those screenshots are from previous swampUP talks here from Oracle and Cisco as an example, where they have these dashboards, and this helps them immensely to provide the feedback to the organization of how the teams are doing and whether this is a valuable change, right? So as an example, the one on the bottom is more on the functional metric side. The one on the top is more of the operational metrics. The thing that gets overlooked quite often, and I think this is because organizations and especially DevOps teams are so used to fighting crisis, you're not thinking of avoiding some common crisis. You can't believe how many times we get support calls where eventually it turns out the storage, it ran out of storage, Artifactory ran out of storage, or DB connections were exhausted, right? These are avoidable, right? You have to do some predictive analysis, but this is the easier part, right? You can do log-level analysis to say what is this rate at which storage is growing. We actually have in mission control a few additional graphs now that can give you a sense of it. I think having this data makes it easy for you to sort of predict with your procurement department, other aspects of your organization that allows you, there's a lead time here, right? In larger organizations, if you're in the cloud, this might be easier, provided you have the quota, right? But in an enterprise organization, some organization, if you want to get a filer, it might take weeks, right? And you may not have time for that to outlast that, right? The last one is the time taken to recover. This is software. Critical issues happen, right? The key thing is, have you invested in tools and methodologies that let you come back very quickly, right? This is part of our SLA promise to you guys as well, and I'm sure you guys, some of you might have experienced it, unfortunately, but this is another measure of saying that, okay, the new tools are, have better capabilities to recover from failures, right? And then, of course, you do a postmortem and make it better, go back to the original cycle of improving things, right? On the second aspect of it, the functional metrics, so this brings back the question of cycle time, right? What is important? Is it important to just go fast? Probably not, right? You can go fast by having less tests or less commits, et cetera, right? So some of this is comparative data that actually helps. We started measuring how many commits are happening, then how many attempts are being made into the pipeline, and then how much of it is successful. That is a true measure, right? You can't just say that, okay, team A is all green, but they did like 2 attempts in the pipeline in a week, right? Similarly, things like changing number of tests, right? This is something that I don't know why it still baffles me, how number of tests can change from run to run and nobody really cares. Come on, we're talking about coverage here, right? So again, measuring this and comparing it is very, very important. Consumption rate. So again, in big organizations, you don't have like one build that goes to production, right? So you have teams, that depend on each other, right? So there's a producer, there's a consumer. We also started measuring that if team A is being consumed by team B, team A's binaries are consumed by team B, how consumable is it, right? So team A could be, churning out many internal releases to the other teams. So let's say they're churning out 10 releases a day, but team B hasn't even picked up a newer version in 1 week. So this actually helps provide a lot of feedback back to QA teams, dev teams. Generally, what we see is either there's a need to run team B tests in a team A pipeline, which is actually a pretty bad idea because team A has no idea how team B's product works, right? So now the debuggability is a problem. More importantly, when you start showing this, what happens is a discussion that says, okay, how do you, establish the public API contracts and establish the use cases and move the tests in a team A environment, and push it back early, right? Finally, gate health check. So this is an interesting one. How do you decide this gate is correct, right? This kind of goes back to the same collaboration that you should do with the teams. If you need to pick the producer consumers, you need to have the, in some organizations, QA might be a separate team, not embedded within development. By the way, at Oracle, we went both ways, right? And we still haven't figured out, or still they haven't figured out which is the right model, right? So in this case, having a common team that decides what is the gate is very important, right? you have to continuously monitor if the gate is good. So as an example, how do you know if the tests are good tests, right? There's probably some level of trend analysis that needs to happen here to say, hey, test A passes 99% of the time is probably a useless test. Why waste resources on it? Test B is very flaky. We don't know whether it's an environment issue or whether it's a test issue. You need to mark it as somewhat flaky, especially if the underlying pipeline hasn't changed. If you run the same pipeline with the same code and the test results are different, there's something fishy here, right? But you need to measure this, right? These are things that, in my experience, the dev side generally, there's a lot more work done in that aspect, at least on the enterprise side, to say, these are the patterns, this is what you should do. When you come to integration tests, et cetera, in a large organization, this becomes a big bottleneck, right? Because it is hard. It is hard to transform organization. It's not like everybody's going to have the same release cadence of releasing multiple times a day, right? That's great. Maybe your organization does not need that, right? So you need to get these measures, from these teams and have them participate on that. Okay, so that's great. That's a large enterprise use case, but it's not very far from what we are experiencing ourselves, right? JFrog, when I joined, was a team, the US team was about 18 people. We are at 70 people today. Just in the last year, the organization almost doubled in size, right? So we are going through the same pain, same transformation, right? So I wanted to share a little bit about how this data-driven approach has helped us improve things, rethink the way we are doing our pipelines. So a little bit of background. So Artifactory, one product, relatively simple code base compared to a large enterprise. The pipeline was simple, right? However, there were reasons for this to start already breaking, right? So first is having this with a limited amount of infrastructure. So we also started, like a lot of you guys are transitioning. We had a colo place with fixed number of servers, a fixed number of resources, and then we added we doubled the amount of developers. So that means now there's resource contention, right? Not only that, our products evolved. So we have more products, we have more types of technology. So while Artifactory is predominantly Java, X-Ray is Golang, right? And then what we also did was, well, Artifactory 5 is a microservice, right? So now suddenly you have a lot more parallelism needs, right? So some of these measures, and some of this was also like our SLA to the developers to say, for example, a Jenkins server is not going to block you, right? Just because it doesn't have resources. So part of this was for us to also think about moving the resources from a colo kind of a thing to cloud, right? So cloud allows us to do much more parallelism, much more scalable infrastructure. And oh, by the way, you can turn it down when you don't want to use it, right? So what you see here is kind of an example of these are the different microservices. We added the number of tests and the number of gates, right? So the need for the organizational need, as well as our commitment to have the release times be the same, drove us to some of these changes. Again, we were measuring these things, right? So there was a change in the pipeline due to those needs. There's a toolset evolution also, right? So the first one I kind of mentioned, from colo to cloud. The second is actually, as we were doing this, we started looking at more optimizations. And in fact, we haven't completed this, right? So and it'll never complete, because as soon as we are done with this, we're going to look at other aspects of it. So Ellie, for example, is still trying to figure out how can he have a good in-process visualization of stuff, right? So while the pipeline is executing, how do you figure out that if this run is going to be successful or not? What is happening? So the example is that flaky test, right? Or let's say variances in an execution time. What you need to do is have better tooling that can allow you to measure whether this test is slowing down because of infra unavailability or resource contention or other things, right? So these are some of the things we have implemented and we are also looking at. The other thing was you guys, right? So if you have an issue and we are saying that we want to bring you back very quickly to a good state, we need to be able to diagnose those issues very quickly, internally reproduce it so quickly. So which means we are also continuously evaluating the tools we are using to get that data in a much sooner manner. The other aspect is, well, you guys do crazy things with our products at crazy scale, right? Now, we are heavily investing in making sure we can reproduce that scale. Certain things that happen at a high scale are not reproducible at small things. So in this sense, this is another one of those feedback that we're hearing from you guys, which is driving this change, right? And we are measuring it. So for example, the number of tickets that are of a certain type, as an example, let's say there are Hazel cost issues for certain sized customers. This is one of the key drivers for us to also invest in a different test infrastructure, right? And so this developer view versus customer environment is a very interesting one. So I faced it at a very large scale at Oracle, and then at a relatively smaller scale here at JFrog, but the goals are the same. Typically, what happens in a large organization is what the developer can actually physically even run on their machines is not what the end customer has, right? So this was one of the requirements we had to say that, okay, every developer should be able to have a customer view of the environment, right? So this started another discussion of saying, okay, if you want to do these kind of builds, local resources are not going to be useful. So how do you have a centralized CI server that allows you to do this, right? And so today, actually, every developer at JFrog can, actually, there's a lot of work driven by Ellie here, can actually use a templatized and automated way of saying, okay, span me up all the pipelines. So for example, if you're working on one module of Artifactory, you can do the entire testing and of all the modules and have your own branch-based view of all the pipelines with the click of a button, right? So again, as we started measuring where the bottlenecks are, this is some of the things we are adopting. And then finally, this cross-pollination. So I talked about multiple products. So we are learning. So bin tray used to be released in a very different way, right? Even simple conversations like the dashboard. So one of the things that happened, and Ellie reminded me of this, was we actually have screens between the developers there that kind of shows even across products what is happening. And a very simple dashboard like that started a discussion of saying, okay, team B is using Jenkins 2 with pipeline, but the pipeline is relatively simple. Team A is still using the older Jenkins, but it is very comprehensive. How do you bring it together and leverage things, right? Again, this was purely based on just two developers looking at their own dashboard side by side and having this conversation, okay? And I think with that, I'll take any questions because I think I will run out of time. Go for it, Mira.
Okay, so if you want to measure all of that, it's very difficult. You have many systems like Jira for tasks, Jenkins for builds, and the production systems. You kind of need to hold all these metrics probably somewhere else. So can you have some recommendation or to hold these measurements, how to do some relationships between them, even like tips for dashboarding?
So I think it's a good. So the question is basically that there's a lot of systems involved, and how do you collect all the data and correlate the data to provide these dashboards, right? So as an example, so some of these systems today have REST APIs to extract data, right? Or if you have logs, you can easily use like an Elk stack to do this, right? I think the key thing here is to say, why do you need to do all of it at once, right? Maybe you pick one or two systems. So as an example, at Oracle, what we started with was to say that, okay, whatever is happening in the CI servers, let's get that data out and make it transparent, right? There's generally some sort of correlation, right? If you're going across different, and in large organizations, everything is not happening in Jenkins, for example, right? So you might have a test farm, which is completely different. So what we did was we said, we are not going to disrupt the entire test farm. It's a bigger effort. Maybe it's phase 2, right? But maybe we'll put enough hooks in it so that it can at least send the information of what it is doing back to a central system. This can be a database of some sort, right?
So my question is about self-service. For example, Artifactory, you said developers should be able to create their own repos.
Yeah.
How does that look like in a big environment? Do they create the repos in a dev environment of Artifactory, and how do you clean up that stuff? I'm just imagine this huge,
Right.
you know.
So one of the examples I showed was Cisco, which is doing this at scale, but they have a self-service dashboard which says right from Git projects to CI servers to the repo pipeline is automated. In my experience, the initial gut feel tells you that, okay, let's control it because it's going to get haywire, and you won't know what to do. What we did, though, was we did a more of an audit approach. So instead of blocking, we started doing auditing to say, okay, per repo, what is the usage? When was the last time the artifacts were published? And then you go about cleaning up in that manner. So that seems a better approach, and actually a less it again cultivates a discussion with the team to say, okay, why are you doing this? If you're worried about a very, people getting too trigger happy here, you can always connect it to something like Jira. So you can do some webhooks to say, okay, if a Jira approval happens, you will kick off the REST APIs, for example, right? So you can always pull some other system into a workflow.
Yeah, so my question is about for organizations that are just starting to put these pipelines together. You were talking about how the metrics are important to prove success, to say that things are improving and that they're better and that this process is working. And one of the key metrics that you were talking about was things like how many of your test cases are passing or failing per, and how many builds, et cetera. It seems to me one of the major challenges for adopting these new pipelines is a lot of orgs don't have a lot of automated testing, and when they come in, that's where they're really weak. And what I tend to see a lot at the customers that I work with is that they will have builds that actually pass the few tests that they have, get all the way through, deploy, roll out, and then fall over, and they have to roll back because there wasn't a test plan that covered something like scale or even other minor things that definitely impact users but weren't caught in the automated tests. How do you make sure that your metrics actually reflect the reality of what's happening in your environment when you could say, well, look, tests are passing. We've never had a failed test because we're not testing the right things.
Right.
Yet people are saying that's not true. Look at all these other things that are broken.
Right. So there's two aspects to this. So one is, and this goes back to those early people that you experimented with, right? So finding these champions is one of the important aspects of this role, right? Is to find those people who want to do the right thing, right? The right thing is painful, but they will do it because they know, and this could be a smaller team. So having that comparative data, for one, helps. So again, going back to my Oracle example, our goal to get the pipeline up and running was to say it has to be able to run one test. So the first step was to say, does the test framework even support this pipeline, right? Once you have that first test running, then these questions will come up very quickly to say that, hey, is this being tested enough? Why are the rest of the tests not the same, right? Or why are you not migrating all the tests? So I think it's kind of both. So you need to have a champion that says that, okay, I'm going to do the right thing for this pipeline because I believe in it. And the second is that having that comparative data makes a very compelling point. But the thing that we also did was at some point you still have these stragglers who will never really want to do this. So we actually started putting some thresholds. So if you have data in some other system that tells you these are the number of tests that has to be executed, we started counting like how many tests were executed and how many tests should have been executed, right? And started failing the pipelines based on that. The other thing is, like in some of these things, what we learned was also the gate doesn't have to be a hard gate to begin with, right? So because you start, when you're bringing some of the new tooling in, what helped us, for example, was to say that, okay, we're going to introduce a gate, but it's not going to fail your pipeline today. But let's say in a week or 2 weeks, this will become a hard gate. So it started giving you feedback that at the moment, you're failing this gate. So do something about it. Otherwise, in 2 weeks, you're going to be blocked. Okay.
One of the scaling issues that we run into organizationally, and that is probably increasing elsewhere, is the failure of dependencies. And dependencies come in a variety of forms. There are packages published to your artifact repo, but the one that's really thorny for us is the sheer number of APIs and the lack of decent SLA enforcement between teams within the company or between our company and the vendors that we use, particularly for I don't know, Salesforce's, the big granted ad of them, they might be disciplined, but then Ping Federated and all these other vendors. And it seems like at one point in my company, if there was a cloud service out there, we bought it and we incorporated it in our pipeline. The problem for the average developer is that those things fail asynchronously, and if your pipeline doesn't run very often, then it might be a week later after one of those failures happened, and then it's a lot of human labor to go in and track down what the hell went wrong with that one. Oh, it's a version update, they sent out a notice or whatever.
Right.
So how do you solve this problem on any kind of a scale? Because it seems to be growing, not...
So this is true in any organization. When we did this first from middleware, that graph was mind-boggling, okay? Not only that, people didn't even know what APIs were being used because there's a public API contract, but teams start leveraging private APIs as well. So you don't even know what is going to break in this consumption pattern. So one of the initial things at least we did, and it worked for us, was to say, we will not do rebuilds. So we care more about runtime compatibility than compile-time compatibility. In some cases, this works. In sort of native or platform-specific code, this is a little bit challenging. But for Java, this was a good approach for us. Now, what this did, though, is the tests would find failures. And this was a good way for us to start asking the question whether this either cyclic dependency of sort needs to be broken, or is there just a bad consumption practice? I think there are a few visualization tools today that can possibly do it. It's still, so we are focusing on the binary side of things. That's why in X-Ray we are giving you a graph of consumption. I think there are, Sonar Source or some other tool should probably give you some of these graphs as well. Yeah, okay. I think we have run out of time. Thank you, guys. Hope you found that interesting.